This Week in Science and Education is presented in association with the Science Coordinators and Consultants Association of Ontario. Visit their website at sccao.ca.
This Week in Science and Education is brought to you in part by the University of Western Ontario, www.uwo.ca. We thank them for their support. This Week in Science and Education is also brought to you by Laurentian University. Check out Laurentian at laurentian.ca. We thank them for their support.
Hey everybody, it's time for This Week in Science and Education. This is your host, Kevin Cougler. Thank you for joining us. Today we're up to T-WiSE, episode number 63. Hey everybody, thanks very much for taking the time to join us. We appreciate your time. We're here with Ann Wilson from Wilfrid Laurier University, and she's going to talk to us about the science of body image. Thanks very much, Ann, for taking the time to be with us.
No problem.
Maybe you could start by giving the listeners an idea of who you are, how you got to be where you are, and what the nature of your research is.
Sure. My name is Ann Wilson, and I am a social psychologist. I work at Wilfrid Laurier University. My job entails both teaching and doing research, and I'm passionate about doing research. I love doing science, and I emphasize that psychology can be done using scientific methods, and to really understand people and their world and how they understand our world, we can use a lot of experimental methods in the lab to really try to do that. What I do research on, I do research in a lot of different areas, but a lot of it has to do with the self and identity. So how do people come to understand themselves, whether they like themselves or not, and the implications for well-being. And the stuff that I'm going to talk about today primarily has to do with one of the areas of interest, which is people's connection to their societal norms and understanding of society's expectations for them. So this research primarily focuses on young adults. A lot of it focuses on women, but not only on. This has implications for both men and women and boys and girls. And specifically, it's about how media and society conveys a very unrealistic standard of appearance and attractiveness, of thinness, of muscularity for men, and of a level of beauty and youth that most of us can't achieve.
Sorry, before you go on, we're supposed to have muscles. Did I hear you say that?
Yeah, unfortunately that's.
We're in trouble, guys. This could be a problem. We're not going to be looking good after in society. Oh well. Anyway, sorry to interrupt. So, for instance, Thomas, let me ask you a question. How do we know? Can we gauge by looking at him whether or not he likes himself? Is that what your research helps us?
No.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I can tell, but you probably psychologist, so.
Okay. Okay, fair enough.
Actually, what my research really tries to get at is some of the questions that you probably heard about in societal debate. Like, we're not the first people to talk about media and supermodel images and images of sports stars and celebrities and how this might affect people's self-esteem. This has been talked about for a while. One of the things that our lab is trying to do is to really zero in on cause and effect, to understand it by applying more kind of strict methodologies to really understand what's going on, rather than just kind of looking out there at the world and scratching our heads and saying, oh, maybe some of this stuff isn't so good. So that's kind of what we're trying to do. And then the second part is to understand the implications. So how does what's happening in society affect the individual, both their self-esteem and their behaviors, their relationships, and a number of other things like that. And then finally, by understanding all of those variables better, we can take information that we learn about what's most harmful and incorporate it into interventions to try to educate people and to try to give young adults, especially really everybody, the tools to be less negatively affected by the things that might tend to make them vulnerable.
Okay, that's a good overview. Who wants to go first with a question for Andy?
Well, hopefully you can hear me. I'm having a bit of trouble with my audio as well, but I'm hoping that I'm coming through okay with you. Actually, and you sort of brought up a question about the difference in the methodologies between the kind of research that you do and what would be maybe more a sort of hard science or a more traditional kind of science. I'm really curious as to your methods and how you say you apply a scientific method to psychology research. Can you maybe get a bit about how that actually works in your lab, kinds of experiments that you would run?
Sure.
I think I got most of that. Did you get
I
that
got
question?
most of it,
Okay.
yeah. It is a little toppy on the side too.
Mm-hmm.
So when I talk about using experimental methods in psychology, sometimes people think about psychology in terms of, a psychologist, lay down on my couch and tell me about your problems and your childhood and stuff like that. And of course that's, a part of psychology, but it's very broad, and a lot of psychologists use fairly concrete scientific methods where, we're still studying people, and there's still a lot of variability. So, sometimes there's some skepticism about how strict our scientific approach is. But my approach typically is to try to control as many factors as we possibly can, and to experimentally vary one or two factors only. So, for example, if I'm interested in cultural norms, then I can make cultural norms very salient to some people by priming them with the kinds of images. By priming, I mean just simply exposing them to a number of images, and have a very comparable group of people randomly assigned to one of the two groups, basically with a flip of a coin. Some people would be exposed to images that don't convey the same cultural norms. So one set of people may be exposed to a really unrealistic view of beauty. Another group might be exposed to a more average or attainable view of appearance, and a third group might be exposed to no view of appearance. That's just one example. Another kind of fun experimental method that we've developed has to do with very temporarily changing people's views of their appearance, because we want to know how, if you have an appearance insecurity, how does that affect your outcomes? So one of the things we've done is we've created these mirrors that we use with women in particular, because women are especially concerned about thinness. So one of our mirrors is a real mirror that gives you, the real reflection of what you look like. Another mirror has made one slightly convex and the other slightly concave. So one of them actually makes you about 10% thinner than you are, and the other one makes you about 10% fatter than you really are. And I gotta say, when I'm finished doing these studies, I'm taking the thin mirror home with me. I
don't think you need that one. You better give it to me.
But when people come into the lab, they, basically with the flip of a coin, we randomly assign them to look into one of these mirrors. We tell them that it's a study about something else. So we say, we want you to try on different hats or different jewelry. So they don't know that it's about their appearance. And that's an important thing, because if people know what the study is about, then they often respond based on how they think you expect them to respond.
Sure.
So that's, there's a lot of complexities in designing a study that allows people to respond in a way that's pretty natural, and that we can, understand their responses as being the same sorts of things that they might experience in everyday life. So in a study like that, the participants who are exposed to a thin version of themselves tend to feel better about themselves. And what's striking is that this has a lot of implications, not only for their self-esteem and their self-view, but also for things like their relationships. So one of the things we've done in our lab is show that women, when they are concerned about their appearance, society tells us that one of women's main social values is appearance. So this is something that one of the cultural norms, especially for women, somewhat less for men, although some men still have this concern. One of the real messages is that if you don't live up to the standards, you're not going to be loved and accepted. And so not only does it make them feel bad about, their body, it makes them feel like people in their lives love them and accept them less. And this has actually had some pretty big implications in some of our studies. So, for example, women are more willing to put up with negative behavior in their relationships, to say, I wouldn't leave my partner if they lie to me or if they insult me, if they have these appearance insecurities. They're less willing to take social risks and to go into a situation to work with strangers that they don't know, and various things like that. So there are a lot of implications that I think are quite important. And part of the problem is that I think that most of them are invisible to people. So women know that there's these norms out there, but I don't think that they recognize how many ways it can affect them on a day-to-day basis.
Wow.
Can I sort of follow up on that? I was reading one of the articles that you sent us as a link, and I thought one of the really interesting points was that when you talk to people about their images, and I think in this case it was whether they were trying to consciously use images from the media to define their own appearance. So am I as hot as the guy from whatever the commercials were, right? So I mean, obviously the answer is yes, but on the average court, but when you ask people, they would say no. I know that I shouldn't try to hold that as my standard of beauty, but that at the same time, if you ask them whether they thought other people did that, they were more likely to say yes, somebody else does use that. So I mean that I think is a really interesting aspect of your research, and maybe talk a little bit about that. That there's this level of we think we're above being sort of victims of these kind of misconceptions, and in fact we're not. So how does that work out? And interestingly, how do you test that? I mean, how do you establish that in a rigorous manner?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's actually where a lot of our current research is going. So I don't have all of the answers, but I can tell you a little bit about it. So in our field, there's a phenomenon that's not just in this area, not just for body image norms, but in general, people think that they're more savvy about the kinds of stuff that's out there than other people. So, other people get more affected by advertising on TV than I do. Other people buy into those, those kinds of things, but I don't really buy into them. And that happens with sociocultural norms as well. So people, sometimes when I talk about this research, I'll have people say, I know that those norms are out there, but, I know that they're not really legitimate, and, I'm a feminist, or I'm smarter than that, and I know that these things aren't really valid, so they don't affect me. But what we're finding is that even if you look at all of those kinds of individual differences, people are bombarded with these norms. So it may be that when you step back and you say, okay, I'm going to put my critical thinking hat on, and I'm going to really, pull apart what I'm seeing in this commercial or on this billboard, then you might be able to kind of step back and say, well, maybe this isn't valid. But we get bombarded with this every single day. We're not always thinking critically. And at the same time, even if we don't buy into them, we tend to think that everybody else buys into them. So since a lot of our effects are relational, it doesn't actually matter whether I think the norms are, valid or not. What matters is that I think the people who are judging me and who are going to, decide whether I'm a good person and a lovable person, whether those people buy into the norms or not.
Yeah.
So
but how do you test that?
Well,
sorry to interrupt. I mean, one of the reasons we want to talk to you is how do you apply the scientific method? So what you're saying makes sense, but how do you actually test that as a scientist? How do you set up an experiment to test whether people really do believe the things that they say they believe?
And we're going to have Ann answer that right after we take this short commercial break to thank our sponsors. We'll be right back in 2 minutes with Ann Wilson, everybody. Thanks for staying with us.
This Week in Science and Education is brought to you by Sheridan Institute of Technology and Advanced Learning. At Sheridan, students shine brighter. Check out sheridanc.on.ca. And
we're back with Ann Wilson at Wilfrid Laurier University. And Ann, it's been a fascinating discussion so far. I have a whole bunch of questions as well, but let's deal with the one that Thomas just posed to you. How do you test for that?
Yeah. So there are a couple of ways that we've tried to, and we're currently working on this because it's quite a difficult problem. So we haven't completely figured it out. So one of the things that we have done when we've done interventions is we recognize, for example, so in an intervention what you do is you go into a group of people, perhaps who have some vulnerabilities, but we think that almost everybody is vulnerable to some extent. So we've gone into to schools, actually. Grades 6 to 8 students are kind of at that stage where these things are really starting to bombard them. And we know that telling students, the images that you see, they're not realistic, these models and celebrities don't even really look like this in real life. We know that telling students those kinds of things and getting them to question and critically think about the legitimacy of the norms is part of what's important. But the other part is hearing from their peers. So we've developed, methods where not only do we get students to think about the messages they're getting from the media, but we also get them to hear from their peers. And that tends to really improve the effects. So if they hear that their peers also question these effects, then it really makes a difference. Methodologically in the lab, we also sometimes use subtle forms of deception. And when I say deception, I mean, very temporarily, we might tell people something that isn't completely true.
You are drop dead gorgeous.
You are too fat.
Sorry, I interrupted you. Sorry, just ignore me. Go ahead, keep going.
So that you'd use a deception where you might tell students something that is important in the context of the study, and you want to see their reactions to that. And then at the end of the study, you would debrief them, which means you tell them all about the physics and what you really did and the reasons for why you had to mislead them temporarily. So, for example, in one set of studies, we told participants that, you know what, you might think that other people buy into these norms, but in fact, about 80% of students in your age group don't buy into these norms. And in the other condition, you would tell people that, yeah, you know what, you think people will buy into these norms, and that's true. Most people do. So that's what people normally believe. But if you change that and you tell people, you know what, other people don't buy this nearly as much as you might think, then that's kind of freeing for people, and it makes them recognize that it's not as big a thing to other people. And so what do you do with that? How do you get that into real life? You can't just go around lying to people all the time. So part of it is finding methods to really get people to talk about this and for people to recognize that, other people are like you. Everybody is sitting there thinking, you know what, I'm smarter than this. I know this isn't legitimate. Other people think it is. But if everybody started talking about that a little more openly, people would recognize that, you know what, nobody actually thinks this is all that legitimate. And it's not what they're using as a basis for judgment.
Colin, it's okay that you haven't dropped that 10 pounds you gained over Christmas. It's okay, man.
Thanks, buddy. I appreciate that.
Thomas
Colin,
had his finger up.
I did, but it's sort of Colin's turn. Colin, have you got something?
No. I was just waiting to something. It's okay.
Then good. I have a question for you. So one of the things that I run into when I will go into high school classes, or I give a lecture to some incoming first-year students here, and I talk a little bit about, so I'm a geneticist, and I talk a little bit about the genetics of obesity, and I work on flies, and it's really interesting that we've, in the last couple of years, a number of labs have developed fruit flies as this obesity model. And one of the issues that I run into when I talk to students about this is we actually have an obesity epidemic in Western society. I mean, I'm from the U.S., which is a big place, right? And I live in Northern Ontario, which is a really big place. So how do you balance the idea that, to some extent, we really do need to tell people, you know what, you are too fat,
Yeah.
with the idea that we don't want to tell everybody, hey, you know what, you're too fat. So, I mean, how do you do with this? Because, I get kids saying, oh, well, and I'll get some, you'll get some kid that you want to say to him, dude, you need to cut down on the cheeseburgers. But he wants you to tell him how all about these flies, that it's their genetics that make them big boned. And it's not the genetics, dude, it's the cheeseburgers. So how do you balance those?
Yeah, that's it's a fabulous question. And it's one we've been grappling with. I do other research too on goal pursuit and motivation to pursue long-term goals. So I do stuff on exercise and healthy eating and that sort of thing. So, but just to answer it in the context of what I've been talking about, one of the simple responses to the idea of striving to be thinner, for example, is, well, maybe that's a good thing. We're in a society that's too fat, so maybe we should all just be looking at supermodels all the time and striving to be thinner. Problem with that is that it tends to encourage the wrong kinds of behaviors. So thinness for thinness sake, rather than say healthiness for healthiness sake. And if you look at why people are restraining their eating, or why people are going to the gym, or what they're doing, how they're doing it in an unhealthy and usually unsustainable way. And if people started to just give themselves a bit more of a break and say, you know what, it doesn't matter what I look like, but I should be striving to have a body and a health status that will let me have the most active and full and happy life as I can, instead of being the skinniest person I can, then I think that people would start having a better set of priorities to be able to focus on that. That's only part of the issue, of course.
Yeah.
Mm.
But if you look at the skinniness of models and the skinniness of people, they've actually been going in the opposite direction.
Right.
So it's not like, that people are getting a break from the media. I actually read a paper recently that there's some economists who are saying, who are responding to some in Europe. They've actually started putting some rules in place for BMI, for body mass index of models. Runway models can't be anorexic, basically. And I think that that's actually a useful thing to do. But the arguments they've been making is that, well, if we start having models be heavier, and by heavier I mean still talking skinny, but just not like dying. Well, that's just going to encourage people to get fat if they're not comparing to such a skinny model. I'd suggest that a lot of what's happening is that people are pursuing something unattainable in an unhealthy way, using dieting spirals that don't work. And a lot of times the people who are dieting the most are the ones who are gaining the most weight and developing just these bad eating habits. So I just think it's we have to go in a different direction to get to health, and this isn't the way to do it.
Speaking
so
of going
promote
in
a healthy
direction,
lifestyle, not a skinny lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So let's go to Colin then, because Colin, you've been listening patiently. I'm really interested in the whole student angle on this. You must see some of these types of issues.
I mean, I do most of my work in high schools, and I mean this is where the issues come to a head all of the time. It's a huge issue. I'm really interested in the connection between how students' self-image and how teenagers and teenage girls and boys see themselves, but then in addition, what we can do in classrooms, because one of the things that we very often see is kids will do projects on self-image or body image or media portrayal of girls or something like that, and then they'll put maybe a little survey together that they'll poll their friends or their classmate and try and learn something about it. What's a way of tying some of your research and the science of this together with what goes on in high schools, for example, so that kids can do something to then learn themselves in the doing that will then help promote some of these lifestyles in a healthy way? What do you think of that?
Yeah.
Ooh, question.
It's a big question.
Ask big
I
questions.
think that to some extent, the thing that we were talking about before having to do with what people think other people think.
Sure.
I think that's one of the most valuable parts of doing it in high schools, is if it starts a dialogue not only among the few people who are interested in it, but more broadly. Then one of the things that reveals, I think, a lot of the time to students is that, I thought that I was the only person who didn't buy into these norms, but it turns out just about everybody doesn't buy into these norms. Right? A classic study in this area was done quite a number of years ago now, but it looked at what women wanted to look like and what men wanted women to look like, and they're not the same thing. Right?
Wow.
So men actually like a little more curve, a little more, men aren't typically looking for super skinny supermodel, and women are after that. So even from the perspective of why people are doing it, sometimes they're getting it wrong. So, recognizing that people don't actually necessarily like you for these features, and that they're going to like you even if you're, even if you're different from that. I think one of the other things, just to broaden it slightly, that it helps with is just getting women to be aware of, women and girls in high school to be aware of how much of their mental resources sometimes get caught up in this. And I think this is true right from the time girls are young. I mean, when I go to the toy store, I have 2 little boys, but when I go to the toy store, I hold my breath and run through the Barbie aisle.
I have an 8-year-old. I know exactly what you're talking about.
And it just bugs me, and I tend not to do this for my nieces and stuff like that, but it just bugs me how early girls are encouraged to start playing with things that are just so gender role focused. And how many of them have to do with appearance right from the outset. And boys are encouraged to play with building toys and engineering and computers and all this kind of stuff to a far greater extent. And I think that, it builds right from those early stages. So even though I'm talking about one specific, time, I'm talking about gender and how it affects young adults, I think that it's part of this layered process that happens right through, right from such an earlier stage.
We've exhausted our time. It's been wonderful having you here, though.
Well, thank you.
And I think we've all learned a lot. Thomas, I think you've learned something. What did you learn today?
This was great. Thank you. I think that the final point there with the complexity is a really good thing. And we've already talked with this about with Lila, my little 19-month-old, with her preschool teacher. And there are parents who object to the boys and the girls playing with the wrong toys.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right? And it's usually because it's a parent doesn't want their boy to turn gay because he plays with Barbies.
Yeah.
But that ends up playing into the and this ends up playing into the same thing, right? That it's now we've gone beyond body image. It's like, well, you play with the wrong toys and you're going to get the wrong sexuality. So it is not an easy thing to deal with at all.
I have to admit, my son has a kitchen. He's 3, but I also bought him a hockey stick this year. So, but I didn't take away the kitchen.
Why not do both? Exactly. There's absolutely no problem letting kids figure out what they like, on both sides.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Sure.
All right, thank you. Really, thank you for coming on. It's fantastic.
Thanks, Ann. Ann Wilson, everybody from Wilfrid Laurier University. Thanks a lot for taking the time to be with us on another episode of This Week in Science and Education. And on behalf of Colin, Jagoe, and Thomas Merritt, this is Kevin Cougler, virtual researcher on call, saying thanks again and see you again next week. Take care, everybody.
See ya.